Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians. We're still in Colossians chapter 2, still looking at verse 18, which talks about this worship of angels. Let's read that verse again. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. Now, we said in yesterday's session that these angels are what we normally refer to as the fallen angels. We know, of course, about the fall of Satan in the Old Testament as he rebelled against God. We also know the Bible teaches there were some who fell with him or rebelled along with him. That's why we often refer to them as fallen angels. So these are part of the heavenly host in rebellion against God. And it seems they crave the worship of humans. They attempt to seduce and mislead humans into worshiping them rather than God. And these false teachers in Colossae have fallen into that. Now, I mentioned this was revealed in the Old Testament, these fallen angels' desire for worship. Let me read you a passage that makes that quite clear. It's from Isaiah chapter 14. We'll start reading at verse 12. This is talking about Satan. Now, the original context of Isaiah 14 is discussing the king of Babylon and his fall. And he says, Isaiah that is, that Babylon was walking in the way of Satan in his fall. And that's what he's describing here. Listen to these words. Isaiah 14, verse 12. How have you fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn? You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. So you see this cry of Satan, I will make myself like the Most High. In other words, Satan wanted to be in the place of God. And so he desires that we worship him. And that's what these false teachers in Colossae are doing, trying to encourage believers to worship angels, fallen angels, demonic hosts, rather than God. Now you might say, well, how in the world do they expect to sell that kind of craziness in the church? Because they teach it by way of deception. Now, we've said before that this Colossian heresy was a form of what would later become known as Gnosticism, a heresy that arose in the early centuries of Christian history. Now, the Gnostics taught that God was so far removed from earth that you really could not relate to him directly. And so that there were a series of supernatural beings between God and humanity. They were called the emanations, each one a little lower than the others. And some of those lower supernatural beings had contact with the earth. So they were teaching you really didn't have or could not have direct contact with God. He was too far above you. But these lower spiritual beings might be accessible to you. And they encouraged the worship of these lower beings. These lower beings perhaps could give you some secret knowledge. That's where the Gnostic part comes in. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word for knowledge. But anyway, these lower angelic beings, the Gnostics taught, could give you some secret knowledge that would one day allow you to ascend up to heaven. But you actually ended up worshiping these angelic beings, these emanations, as the Gnostics taught. So see, they were teaching this rather deceptive philosophy. You couldn't have contact with God, but there were these angelic beings, these emanations lower than God. You could have contact with them and you could worship them. Now basically, of course, what is behind all of this is that demonic teaching trying to get people to worship them rather than God. And so this Colossian heresy is gaining some hold in the church, teaching a false knowledge that will give you some secret knowledge to get up to God. And you do so by worshiping these supernatural beings who are lower than God, but still supernatural. It's demonic deception, trying to get people to worship angels. Paul says, have nothing to do with that. You worship only the Lord. That's why I said that in Christ, all the fullness of deity dwells. Jesus is fully God. We worship only God, and he is fully God come to us. We have nothing to do with some angelic beings that supposedly are between us and God, and we're certainly not going to worship them. We worship only the Lord, who is himself fully God. All the fullness of God dwells in him, for he is God come to us. So Paul just explodes that false teaching of Gnosticism, says, don't worry about those, quote, angelic beings, and don't you worship them. You worship only the Lord. Your life is hid with Christ in God. All right, tomorrow we're going to start looking at chapter 3. Paul continues to give some practical advice for the church and how to live fully by faith in Jesus Christ. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians.